Hey guys, Sam from West Meadow Rabbits here, and today we have a very important, sometimes controversial topic for anybody interested in producing their own meat, whether you're a homesteader, small farmer, or concerned consumer. And that is the question of which is the best source of meat for the small-scale producer. Is it rabbits or chickens? Now, if you're from the Western world at all, especially the US, you know that chicken is the default cheap meat. It is something that everybody eats at one point or another. It's incredibly common. It's served basically everywhere, and it is very inexpensive. So when we're designing our small farms, homesteads, or even just saying, hey, I want to produce some of our own meat, we typically think about what meat we find in the grocery store and if we could produce that on our own. Now, obviously, the larger ruminants, especially cows, are impractical on the small scale for most people. And the other ruminants, such as goats and sheep, require a good amount of infrastructure and handling. And pigs are a whole different animal, both literally and from a care perspective. So we often find ourselves saying, you know what, I'm going to start with chickens. That's a nice, easy, entry-level animal to get into producing my own meat on my homestead, or maybe starting a small farm. You know, many of us have read Joel Salatin's Pastured Poultry Profits. It's a classic, and it seems like chickens are the winner. But when we think this way, we're often limiting ourselves based on what is common default American fare and not necessarily considering what's actually the best on its own merits. So today I want to humbly suggest that meat rabbits are superior to chickens in almost every way for producing your own meats and as a source of healthy, inexpensive protein. Now, rather than me just going off on a tangent and telling you why I think they're better, I've got a list of 6 specific ways in which meat rabbits outperform chickens. And I'm not being biased here. I've had chickens, I love chickens, I still enjoy eating chickens. This is an old chicken coop. But for the small producer, the small homesteader, and especially anybody in a more suburban and urban context, I really think rabbits are better. And the reason we don't use them as much is more of a cultural thing than any kind of objective reason on why we shouldn't. Now, before we jump into the list, just a quick caveat. This is primarily geared towards the smaller scale producer. So that's anybody from somebody with a tiny urban micro farm up to a small-ish, medium-sized farmer, you know, somebody who's got 50, 100, 150 acres and is serving kind of a niche market. At larger scales than that, I think the information I'm saying still holds true, but when you get to that scale, a lot of the variables start to change and the priorities also start to change. So while I do think rabbits are better in pretty much all contexts, at a larger scale, the list would look a little different. Now, for this comparison, I am assuming a standard meat rabbit breed like a New Zealand or a Californian going up against the industry standard Cornish cross meat bird. Now, the Cornish cross is a genetic miracle, if you want to call it that. It's been incredibly perfected, and it operates very well in industry contexts and marginally well in alternative farm contexts, as we've seen with people like Joel Salatin and Richard Perkins. We're going to get into the specifics of that later, but for the sake of this comparison, assume we're comparing these two animals. If we were comparing meat rabbits versus other breeds of chickens, which are far less efficient than the Cornish cross, even more so does the meat rabbit pull ahead versus the chicken. So just keep that in mind. So with that, let's jump into point number 1, and that is the early stages of life. Meat rabbits do not require an incubator. They don't move through an egg stage. They don't require a brooder. They are very fast maturing, self-reliant animals. So with chickens, anybody who's done chickens knows that if you're buying day-old chicks, you need a brooder stage for at least a few weeks. That requires a heat lamp, electricity. It's not a ton, but it's something that needs to be considered. The chicks require a totally separate feed than the adults, and if you are raising your chicks from eggs, then they also need to go into an incubator, which again is another piece of equipment that requires daily tending. On the larger scales, a lot of this is automated, but on the small scales, that's not an insignificant investment. I mean, if you're buying an incubator that you're using once a year, twice a year, and then it's just sitting around, that's not necessarily the best use of your limited resources. Now, you compare that with meat rabbits, which are mammals, so while those babies are born just as helpless as a chick, if not more so, because they can't eat solid food, they're blind, they can't move around, they're born in a nest where the mother takes care of them for you. She's feeding them, she's grooming them, she's making sure everything is okay with them. And within a few weeks, those rabbits are also up, hopping around, eating solid food, and they're getting that extra boost of nutrients from milk versus where chicks have to get all their nutrients from the solid food they're eating. So you kind of get a boost in growth rates, especially during those first few weeks. The chicks have to get all that nutrients from solid food, which is not necessarily the biggest deal, but the bigger deal is that it's totally separate infrastructure processes. Now, some of you may be saying, well, can't I raise the chicks naturally underneath the hen? And you certainly can, and that works on the smaller scales, but it is worth pointing out that, again, a chick is not going to be as closely taken care of as a baby rabbit kid is by its mother. Mammals and birds have different life cycles. Birds are expected to fend for themselves a little earlier, so you will suffer some mortality there as well. Again, it's not a deal breaker either way in this department, but the fact that a small scale producer does not have to worry about 3 totally different life stages, and your fryers can be raised in the same cage with their mother from birth to processing, that is not insignificant. It's useful on the small scale because it saves you limited space and resources to focus, and on the large scale, you don't have to worry about these totally separate processes. And this brings us to point number 2, control over your animal's genetics and your breeding program genetics. When it comes to chickens, you are getting it from one of 3 sources. You are getting it from day-old chicks from a hatchery, you're getting hatching eggs from a hatchery, or possibly a small farmer near you, or you are running your own chicken breeding program. All 3 of these things present unique challenges with chickens, especially for the small producer. Start with breeding your own chickens. This has some unique challenges, especially for anything more than a homesteader in a rural area. Roosters are very tricky to keep. Now, again, they're not tricky in that they cause problems for an experienced farmer or anything like that. It's more of an issue in that a suburban and especially urban context, they are loud. Now, are they as loud as hens? Yes, no, it's debatable. Hens can be just as loud sometimes, but there's no doubt that one rooster is pretty loud and multiple roosters are going to spend all day crowing at each other. This isn't a problem for rural people, but in an urban context, especially where it's, kind of quasi-illegal to produce your own food, a subject for a whole different video, this can cause problems. And the last thing you need is a neighbor who already dislikes you and now they've got an excuse to shut you down. And unfortunately, I've seen this happen too many times to even count. Even with friends in our semi-rural area, suburban, 1-acre lots, cities will go to the mats to try to stop people from raising their own food, and roosters definitely don't help with that. And on a larger scale, the American market is not really used to eating fertilized eggs, and while it's not a particularly big deal, that little spot of red can sometimes turn off consumers, especially those who aren't used to it. So yeah, breeding chickens and raising them the natural way under the hen is not super hard for a small-scale homesteader in a very rural area. If you are looking to sell to market or you're looking to keep your own meat in a more suburban context, it becomes very difficult to breed your own chickens. That basically leaves you at the mercy of the industry. Now, there are some great hatcheries out there, and I applaud a lot of them for trying to keep rare breeds of chickens in existence. But that being said, when your genetics are concentrated in a few gigantic hatcheries, let alone if you're raising Cornish cross, which is really the only practical meat bird, you are now totally beholden to the factory farming industry for all of your genetics in your operation. It's not optimized for local conditions. It's certainly not optimized for, sustainable, natural raising of animals. So you've got a huge mismatch, not to mention you're not able to control it locally. These are a few centralized facilities producing the vast majority of Cornish cross chicks. Any interruptions in supply chains, in distribution chains, in any kind of outbreak of bird flu, and you're totally cut off from your supply of meats. Now, from a prepping perspective or a control of your own food perspective, this is a really big problem. A lot of the reason we want to opt out of the industrial food system is to be more sustainable, to be more resilient, and to have more control. So great, you're raising your own chickens in your backyard, but that stock and those chicks are coming from this industrialized system. You're still just as vulnerable as if you were buying grocery store meat. Whereas with meat rabbits, because they're so small and because they're so quiet and self-contained, pretty much anybody, even in a garage, you can have a fully functional breeding program with dozens of rabbits and not have to worry about bringing in any outside genetics for generations. And you can completely control your herd's genetics. You can select what you want to breed for, and it's much easier than mob breeding with 1 rooster and 10 hens because everybody is in their own cages. You can mix and match genetics as you see fit. And again, you could do that with chickens, but it requires a lot more infrastructure because Keeping chickens in tiny cages is very difficult to do for an animal that likes to roam around and fly, whereas rabbits, as I've talked about before, are underground burrow-dwelling animals that never move more than 100 meters from their homes, so they're much more happy in confined cages and are therefore easier to control genetically. You can optimize your herd for your exact local conditions, your own personal tastes, and your own desires, which is not something most people are going to be able to do with chickens. Now, for point number 3, easier processing. Again, this kind of goes back to infrastructure. I don't care what anybody says, plucking a chicken is miserable. And, you know, if you want to buy a chicken plucker or make a chicken plucker, that's fine. We run into the same issues again, though, where at the small scale, that's a piece of infrastructure that you have to make or buy that isn't getting used a lot. And if it's at the large scale, this is a piece of infrastructure that's probably going to have to be pretty substantial, is still not getting used every day, and is going to need to be maintained, repaired, etc. Now, part of the reason meat rabbits haven't taken off in the US is because they're mammals and they're cute and cuddly, unlike a bird, which is kind of foreign looking and easier to disassociate from, regardless of how silly this is from an ethics perspective. But the beauty of that is that you've got one pelt, a quick cut, pull off, you're done. No mess, no problem, no feathers going everywhere. It's much quicker to process, in my opinion, a meat rabbit than a chicken, especially at a smaller scale. I'm not going to dwell on this one too long. It seems fairly obvious. You know, gutting an animal, but those feathers are really a big problem for me. This brings us to point number 4, which is that rabbits are cleaner, quieter, and have more uses. This is kind of my catch-all point, but let's break them down one by one. Rabbits are cleaner in that they produce solid, pelleted, fibrous manure. Bird manure is wet, it splatters, and it's very rich in ammonia. It has an incredibly strong smell and is difficult to clean up, especially if it, gets all over the place. Rabbits, on the other hand, while their urine is a bit of a pain and calcium heavy, that's relatively easy to deal with. I've put in other videos how to dissolve that calcium on your equipment, but from a manure perspective, that manure is, if it's dry, it's fine to even pick up with your hands. It's not gross at all. Whereas chicken manure is very wet, very nitrogen rich. Rabbits are obviously quieter. They don't do any vocalizations except when they're in extreme distress and you get that, horrifying rabbit scream. But that's very rare and shouldn't happen unless you've got very jumpy rabbits or, a very unusual circumstance. On the other hand, chickens are birds and they're flock birds, so they're constantly vocalizing to each other all day. Now, personally, I actually enjoy it. I find it very soothing. And again, in a rural area, this is less of an issue, and it's definitely less of an issue at scale where you're on a farm. However, in a suburban and urban context, it's typically a bad thing to have a lot of noise, especially if you're doing this under the radar. It draws unnecessary attention. Rabbits are quiet enough and they're clean enough that you could keep them in a shed in a very urban context on less than a half an acre, and nobody would know they were there. Now, finally, my maybe most controversial point here is that I believe meat rabbits have more uses than chickens. So, while it's technically true you can get meat and eggs from a bird, the reality is that chickens are not very good at doing both of those things. Something people don't realize is that chickens were originally domesticated for fighting. That was the primary reason chickens were domesticated. They weren't domesticated for egg production. They certainly weren't domesticated for meat production. Those may have been nice byproducts, but that wasn't the point. So while industry has gotten very good at making chickens that lay a lot of eggs and chickens that produce a lot of meat, you don't see much crossover. Just like with dairy cows, you would never say a Holstein Friesian, which is the main industry dairy cow, which has got bones sticking out everywhere and every ounce of its energy going to milk production, is anywhere near as good as one of the beef cattle breeds that are out there. In the same way, almost every heritage breed dual-purpose chicken has been optimized over the years away from the meat purpose and more toward the egg purpose. So while yes, you will get a stewing hen with some meat on it that makes it worth butchering and stewing, when we say dual purpose, it's more like it's an egg-laying chicken that isn't a total waste when you go to kill it because you can get some meat off of it for your chicken soup. It's not a meat animal. Now, there has been some attempts to produce a more sustainable, free-range, tougher, optimized chicken for meats, but they have mostly not come anywhere close to the Cornish cross as far as productivity goes. Meat rabbits, on the other hand, give you a steady supply of 3 things in abundance. First of all, they're going to outperform pretty much every breed except the Cornish cross in meat production, so you get the meat. Second of all, while I don't typically do it, they can provide pelts. Chicken feathers are not really useful for much, and I don't think anybody would enjoy sleeping on a chicken feather pillow. Rabbit pelts, on the other hand, especially if your rabbits are older or older breeding stock, are able to provide you with a very nice piece of clothing or blankets, especially if you learn how to work with it. Unfortunately, the fur ecosystem has really decayed in the US, with it being taboo in most instances, and the artisanal aspects, basically wiped out by industrial competition. It's still something that, could be provided to you if you needed it. And third, rabbits provide manure that, in my opinion, is superior to chickens. Rabbit manure is dry, it can be directly applied to crops, it can be easily bagged and sold, it can be, thrown onto the lawn like regular fertilizer pellets, and is all around more pleasant to work with. Now, don't get me wrong, I have nothing against chicken manure. My original garden was almost entirely fueled by chicken manure. I built probably over 8 inches of topsoil with chicken manure, but it does need to be composted. It can't be directly applied to plants, which is not a major con, but again, in a more urban context, you may not have room for composting, or you may not have room for serious composting with a lot of chicken manure, and chicken manure is more noxious in general, which produces problems as far as odor is concerned, whereas rabbits, that's immediately usable. Now, it's not necessarily fair to compare meat rabbits to egg-laying hens, because the egg-laying is their main purpose. If I'm comparing a rabbit to a Cornish cross gives me one thing only. That's meat and possibly manure to compost. Rabbits against a Cornish cross give me meat, they give me better quality manure that's easier to work with, and they can give me pelts if I need that. Now, this brings us to point number 5, which is arguably the most important, and that is feed efficiency and source. Feed efficiency is the most important thing for anybody producing their own meat, whether it's at a small scale or a large scale. It is the measure of how much of what you feed your animals gets converted into useful meat, and how much gets turned into waste energy as heat or is used to maintain the animal's body and life. On paper, there is no competing with the Cornish cross. In my opinion, the bird is both a miracle and a monstrosity. Under the best circumstances, the Cornish cross can achieve 2 pounds of feed for every 1 pound of meat. That is pretty freaking incredible. That is an incredibly efficient animal. But of course, there's some caveats here. That is in a factory farming context where everything is optimized, it's indoors, it is totally controlled. There's also some ethical issues around the Cornish cross. Part of the reason it can achieve that efficiency is because all of its efforts are going into turning that food into body mass. There's not a lot of effort going into balanced growth, into maintaining a functional animal, and in many cases the Cornish cross, if it's left to be older than 8 weeks, which is the processing age, it'll usually die from some kind of organ failure because its body is not actually functional for a living animal. Now, regardless of the ethical issues, when you take the Cornish cross out of the factory farming context, that efficiency rate does go down a little bit, and you have increased mortality. And a lot of the more natural farmers that I've mentioned, like example, Joel Salatin, Richard Perkins, a lot of guys who do permaculture, they've talked about how over time, while the Cornish cross has gotten more efficient, it's become less and less robust. These animals are very easy to die. They're not like your typical Rhode Island Red that can take anything you throw at it and rough it. Even an extremely cold day, exposure to moisture, being scared, all these different things can cause the animals to die. They have absolutely no survival instinct whatsoever. While that efficiency is very, very good and it blows any other chicken out of the water, compared to meat rabbits, it's just not as much of an advantage. I mean, again, if you look at what Joel Salatin has to do to raise his Cornish crosses, he has to go out there and scare them for the first few nights so they learn how to sleep under a roof. That kind of level of attention that's needed is really not ideal. And the reason we deal with it is because, again, no chicken comes anywhere close. A Cornish cross is at 6 pounds at 8 weeks and ready for processing. The Red Rangers, which I think are the closest alternative as a more robust animal that does have a survival instinct and can actually free range, you're not hitting that till 16 weeks at the earliest. That's twice as long, twice as much feed, and way less efficient. Now, meat rabbits are almost as efficient as the Cornish cross, but not really there fully, especially if you are not feeding just a commercial diet, which we're going to get to in a sec. But they are still very efficient, and broadly speaking are more efficient than most other chicken breeds. For example, a fryer meat rabbit is going to hit 5 to 6 pounds within 8 to 12 weeks, closer to 12 for the 6 pounds. So that's still much faster than the next closest alternative chicken. Sorry for the odd cut, had to take the jacket off, it's getting a little warm. But back to what I was saying, the biggest issue with the Cornish cross is that they need this high protein, energy dense feed in order to achieve those incredible performance results. Mainly grain. I mean, a chicken diet is almost exclusively a grain-based diet. Now, even when we see people out on the pasture raising the Cornish cross in the chicken tractors, they're still getting 90 to 95% of their calories and dietary requirements from their chicken feed, which is to say they're getting it from grain. They're not like robust Rhode Island red layer hens that are going to be out there aggressively foraging. They have no survival instinct, no foraging instinct. And yes, it's nice from an ethical perspective to be doing that, and you get the added benefit of fertilizing your fields, but they're really not capturing a ton of that energy value. The other big issue here is that this is where the most valid criticism, in my opinion, that vegans and vegetarians have of us meat eaters comes from. They say that the grain that is going to feed meat animals could, in theory, be used to feed humans, because it doesn't matter how efficient the meat animal is. It's always going to be more efficient to just directly eat the grain. Grain is hyper palatable and very easy for us to digest. Now, of course, I would have many qualms with a grain-based diet, and I do, but that's a subject for another video. But that is a big issue. Now, to be fair, obviously they are using, for some reason, beef cattle as the poster child of the climate issue with meat or whatever, but as we know, beef and other ruminants, even factory farmed ones, spend most of their time on the range, and most of that feed that they're eating includes fibrous grain byproducts and not actually that much grain. The biggest consumers of grain, edible grain to humans, is pigs, chickens, and dairy cattle. Now, dairy is even more efficient than chickens, and we're not going to get into that in this video, but the point is it's really chickens and pigs that are eating human quality grain on a regular basis. Now, again, you could take this as an environmental issue and say we're, basically using farmland, turning it into monocropped, industrial farmed grain fields, and then feeding it and losing a ton of energy to chickens. But you could also just take the practical part of it. If you're a prepper or a homesteader, or you don't like industrial agriculture and you're trying to opt out from that system, by definition, if you have chickens, you are still somewhat locked into that system. Any of the major feed manufacturers are doing industrially farmed grain. Even organically farmed grain, if it's done at scale to the point where you could actually afford it and not pay $100-something for a bag of chicken feed, it's being done at a large scale. And those grain fields, they need to be monocropped. They're annual crops, they're not perennials. They're being treated, even if it's not with a chemical pesticide, they're still being treated with organic pesticides, assuming you could even find organic. And they're also getting that loss of biodiversity because you either have to plow or flame weed or spray. You got to do one of the three. And this is really where I think meat rabbits take the cake, because they are fully capable, not only capable, but their actual ideal diet is a grain-free diet. Now granted, the majority of commercial pellet ingredients, which I feed extensively, is alfalfa, which is another commonly monocropped industrial crop. It doesn't have to be. And the rest of the pellet is basically just byproducts, again, from industrial means. Now, I choose to supplement with pellets because there's a certain balance of, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So yes, if you're going to feed in your backyard, feed some pellets if you have to in order to get you into meat rabbits. But the great thing is they can be heavily supplemented with stuff that can be totally sourced locally within 50 feet. If you had a half-acre lot, and in theory you couldn't access pellets, you could put those rabbits in rabbit tractors, and they could get 100% of their caloric requirements from the ground right in your yard. They would be taking a useless product, which is grass or leaves or any kind of vegetative matter, and turning that into a very useful product, which is meat. Without grain, there is no Cornish cross. Without grain, you've got happy rabbits. They'd actually prefer a fresh diet that can be formulated. And again, you're opting out of the system because if you're reliant on grain to feed your birds, you might as well just go to the supermarket, because it just takes one supply chain failure and all you're doing is making your life more difficult. You can go buy organic meat from a farmer and it's the same thing as raising your own. Granted, you have more ethical control, but from a resiliency and a prepping perspective, you're just as vulnerable. Whereas rabbits, they're totally capable of being entirely commercial feed free. Yes, it's a little more labor for you, and yes, instead of hitting 5 pounds at 8 weeks, it's going to be closer to 12 or 13 weeks, but they're still beating any chicken that is purely pasture raised. You're not going to get close to that on just pasture raised chickens alone. And even at scale this works, because think about a hayfield, a holistically managed hayfield. That hayfield, it can just be left alone. Rabbits don't need a specific breed monocropped hay. Now they do it, but you don't have to do it that way. You could have a hayfield that's teeming with biodiversity and all different plant species and is hayed at the right time so the birds and the animals can nest in it, and you'd be able to feed a ton of rabbits off that no problem. Now you wouldn't get close to the efficiency you have with the Cornish cross, but I assume if you're watching this channel, you're aware of the downsides of that system. And from a backyard perspective and a smaller scale perspective and a homesteading perspective, there's absolutely no competition. You can raise rabbits without bringing stuff in. You can't do that with chickens. And that leads us to my final point here, which is sustainability. As far as all around sustainability goes, mostly due to the last point I discussed in how they're fed, rabbits take the cake. Rabbits are able to utilize local resources that have little to no value to humans and provide an incredibly valuable product in return. Two, actually. They provide delicious and nutritious meats, and they also provide incredibly valuable manure for composting. Chickens cannot do that to the same level rabbits can, and as a result you get all the other tacked on environmental benefits, lower carbon footprint, more efficient, etc., etc. And ultimately, the reason rabbits are great are the same reason cows, sheep, and goats are great. They're the reason why our ancestors domesticated ruminants in the first place, because they can do the ruminant miracle. They can take what we cannot eat and turn it into something we can. Chickens and pigs definitely have their uses, especially as recycling machines, and it's okay sometimes to have an energy loss, because I don't think humans should be eating a purely grain diet. And grain is easy to grow at scale, so it makes sense to feed something that's not necessarily great for humans to eat in huge quantities to animals that can convert it at a slight loss into something we can. I'm not crapping on chickens. I think they're great. When they go up against meat rabbits, especially if you have to pick one, I would always pick the meat rabbit. Now, in conclusion, guys, I think it's pretty obvious at this point that meat rabbits are superior to chickens. One of the main reasons we still do chickens is because they fit very nicely into the industrial agriculture system. There's also cultural aspects. You know, people get the fluffy freak out factor, as I like to call it, and the fact that, you know, we've been eating chicken for so long, there's a lot of cultural baggage there, recipes, tradition, etc. And I'm not here to crap on chickens. I think chickens are awesome. I've been planning on moving for several years, and whenever I eventually do and get some more land, I absolutely will have chickens. I think eggs are a great source of protein, love eggs, can't live without eggs, and I probably will raise some meat chickens just for, you know, having that, just for the fulfillment of raising it, but I'm not going to pretend like it's super efficient or anything. In most cases, I'd rather just buy from a local farmer who specializes, and I'm not going to pretend that that system that I'm buying from is as resilient as my own backyard meat rabbits. And at the end of the day, I think we all should strive to eat less chicken if possible. And no, I'm not saying I want to put small farmers out of business, just the opposite. There's a lot of animals that would be better for small farmers too, that there's just not market demand for. Big examples that jump out to me are, again, primarily grass and plant eating animals. Geese are a hugely underutilized animal in the US, which are, again, very efficient at converting less valuable stuff into valuable stuff. To a lesser extent, turkeys and ducks as well, obviously meat rabbits. These are all things that we should explore, and the reason that we are so hyper-focused on chicken, beef, and pork as our three major meats is not because of any inherently good traits that these meats or animals have. It's because they fit nicely into the industrial agriculture system. And again, I'm not saying we're going to knock over the industrial agriculture system in one day. There are some good things about it. It provides a lot of cheap protein, but subjects for different videos. So I know this was a super long video, and I apologize for making it so long. I wasn't planning on going this long, but I think it's really important information for you to consider, especially at the smaller scale when you're going to start with an animal. I think it's really important that you kind of weigh your risks and rewards here. I feel like most people who are getting into small scale meat production are doing it for similar reasons. You know, they want to kind of be less reliant on an unstable food system. They have ethical issues with the food system. They have issues with the environmental impacts of the food system, and they want more control. And I think in all of those dimensions, the meat rabbit really is superior. Of course, feel free to disagree. If you think I am totally wrong or missed something, feel free to let me know in the comments. At the very least, I hope you found this video interesting and thought-provoking. If you did, be sure to give it a like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I will see you in the next one.